Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation with political economist Mark Blyth. He teaches at Brown University. We're going to talk about a lot of things, including what seems to me the madness of what's going on in the economy. And we're going to try to make sense of the news that we are bombarded with, ranging from Donald Trump's so-called big, beautiful bill to tariffs to inflation. But more than all of this, we're going to talk about history and how economic policy over the past 50 years has resulted in American workers earning their largest portion ever in relation to GDP. This is in 1973 to today, in which it's corporate profits that are at their highest point ever in relations to GDP. Mark Blyth is the author of the book Austerity, The History of a Dangerous Idea. His latest book, which is co-authored with Nicolò Fraccaroli, is called Inflation, a guide for users and losers. Mark Blyth, as I said, it is a good pleasure, sir, to welcome you back to this program. Thank you for taking the time.
It's great to be back.
In preparing for our conversation, I did watch a few of the more recent interviews that you have done that you can find easily online. And I noticed a trend at the beginning of many of these interviews. You're always willing to start wherever the interviewer wants to start as the entryway in, because there's so much going on. And all morning I kept thinking to myself, well, where do I want to start? How do we begin? And and I have to be very honest, I'm quite overwhelmed with everything, especially on the economic news. This week, the Senate will begin taking up this so-called big, beautiful bill. We're still having issues around tariffs, obviously around inflation. I wonder, will I be able to make it in another year or two? What does artificial intelligence mean to the economy and to people's livelihoods moving forward? And of course, all of this, again, about your latest book, Inflation. Am I going to be able to afford to survive in this world? So let me ask you, as somebody who does pay attention to this closely, who has a deep understanding of economics, what stands out to you right now in this moment?
All of the above. I mean, everything you just mentioned. I mean, a simple way for people to think about this is, remember when things were cool? Even if they weren't great, they were cool, which is basically the 80s and the 90s, even into the early 2000s. Central bankers talked about this period in the United States as the Great Moderation. And over on the British side, they called it the nice years, non-inflationary consistent expansion. Everything was great. And then we had this giant financial crisis. And we basically bailed out the financial sector. Now, why did we bail out the financial sector? Because the financial sector holds the private sector's assets. And if they all go to zero and everything goes bad, then really bad things happen. So we bailed them out. That then leads to a massive increase in public debt because it's the public sector bailing the private sector. And then we said, look at all that debt. That's terrible. We have to do something about that. So then we did austerity, which shrunk the economy and made the debt bigger rather than smaller. And then people were getting really annoyed by this, and also the fact that they were being affected by trade policies, the Midwest and the Southeast of the United States in particular, when China joined the WTO. And there was a sense that for the elites, for the top 20%, everything was great. It was still the nice years. It was still not moderate anymore, but it was still going well. But for everyone else, it hasn't been going well. And Brexit was the warning shot. Trump 1.0 was the first serious intervention. But the free trade consensus collapsed around 2015, around the same time, with the collapse of the transatlantic and trans-Pacific partnership agreements. The WTO gets sidelined. Tariffs are back. And we live through a world with COVID. And then after COVID, we come out of COVID and suddenly it's like AI is going to change everything. And everyone's like, hold on a minute, what is going on here? And the whole world is basically now working in a kind of like, let's say, stressed and highly volatile environment. And it's just changed the game and the mood for everyone. Another book that I did actually released in the pandemic when the bookstores were shut because I'm a marketing genius was called Angrynomics. And Angrynomics really went into this and basically looked at what we called the macro side of big financial crashes and why that usually produces right-wing populism. But also what we got really interested in was the micro side of Angrynomics, the stressors that are on people, the stressors that are on people, the things that, the government used to take care of or your firm used to take care of, like healthcare, it's now on you. Right? Education is now on you in the form of debt. right? Public housing, forget that. That died in 1980. So a lot of the things that used to be sort of things that took the stress off individuals has been doubled down on them at a time when basically wages have been stagnant for all the stuff I've been talking about. And the top 20% has been making out and the bottom 80% has been saying, what's going on here? And I think that's kind of our background to everything.
In some ways, I feel like we're returning to the pre-New Deal years, before government became more active in these things that you laid out.
Well, that was certainly the ambition of Doge. I mean, essentially kneecap the federal government. I mean, Grover Norquist and the people behind this movement for the past 30 years are quite explicit about this. And Grover Norquist, where they want to take the federal government and drown it in the bathtub. Right? So this is basically both sort of like libertarian anti-tax crusade, anti-government, anti-statism. And, this is a heady brew that the Republicans have been brewing for 40 years. You basically take charge, you make things don't work. And then when things don't work, people say the state sucks. And they go, yeah, I told you the state sucks. You should vote for me. I won't really fix it, but we'll all just say the state sucks. And we've been doing this over and over again. And now guess what? The state sucks. So now you can go after it with Dodge and now it will really break.
During the pandemic, I see it as such a lost opportunity. And there was a moment in the pandemic where I actually felt hopeful because we saw what government was capable of doing in the United States. We saw the lowest, we saw a significant drop in childhood poverty during the pandemic. And to me, it was a demonstration like we saw in the 1930s and the 40s and the New Deal. And I know it's complicated. You got World War II and all these other things. But to me, during the pandemic, I felt like it demonstrated that government can play an active role in alleviating poverty in this society. And I felt like, and this happened during the Biden years, this didn't happen during the Trump years. It didn't take too long for them to start rolling back some of those initiatives. And now today, we're frequently told, and I think it's sort of this accepted notion that we spent too much money, that we had to bring that right back.
So we can bring in, the book, why I wrote the book, etc., because part of it has to do with the whole notion of we spent too much money, the Biden stimulus. One of the best sort of analytics on this is from the San Francisco Fed, and they said, yeah, it definitely caused inflation. Anywhere between 0.9 and 3.1% of the inflation, which is to say nothing or a really large chunk. We don't really know. And the way this doesn't pass the sniff test for me is there were 30 countries impacted by inflation and only one of them had the Biden stimulus checks. So how does that work then, right? And when you started to look into it, it was quite obvious what was going on were what we call supply shocks. Basically, you can't get stuff, so the price of the remaining stuff gets bid up. So what happened in Europe was a supply shock to do with their supply of Russian gas. So they had to spend 12 to 15 months buying it from Qatar and building new terminals and all this sort of stuff. And that pushed up prices right through the supply chains of everyone. And then on the US side, we couldn't get anything because we make everything in Asia and then import it through LA. And that created a huge bottleneck and then prices went up. And at the same time, what was fascinating to me and my co-author Nick was, so, the people who are in charge of this sort of stuff, the central banks, what do? They're like, well, we need to look at the labor market. And you're like, why do you need to look at the labor market? Well, the last time we did this was in the 70s. And what happened was people's expectations of prices became unanchored. You're like, okay, what does that mean? It means that they come to expect rising prices and then they bargain for higher wages. And then companies have to raise their prices. And then the two of them go up together and you get caught in this wage price spiral. We have to be very careful with that. And you stop for a minute and go, yeah, but in 1970s, 30% of the US was in unions. All production was at home. So if you went on strike, it held up production. It was a credible weapon to get wage increases. And yes, part of the 70s inflation was absolutely wages were pushed above productivity levels and therefore prices went up. That happened. I'm not disputing it. But now 9% of people are in unions and they've got no hold-up power. Why are you looking at that? And I thought that was really puzzling. Then, as the debate went on, it was, okay, well, it's not just the labour market, government spends too much money. We admit there's supply shocks, and this is the whole Paul Krugman, team transitory stuff around inflation. And it was interesting because, I'm like, yeah, I think that's probably the case. But the way they spoke about it is always super interesting. They were saying it's not the 70s, it's the 1940s. I'm like, why? Well, because it was kind of like demobilization, right? You were going through this period of change. And then you get the Korean War, and then everything's short. You need steel and all this sort of stuff. You need to ramp up your military. So there's short-term supply crunches, and that raises prices. But ultimately, the supply side adjusts, and people's expectations adjust, and that's it. Like, all right, so how do we know this is the 40s rather than the 70s? And the answer given was kind of, well, people just know it's not the 70s. And you're like, really? Do they? Because as far as I'm aware, most people have no idea what happened in the 70s, let alone the 40s. So why are we basing so much of this on this notion that people have these incredibly well-formed views of prices, right, and update their price preferences all the time? So Nick and I started looking into this, and it's interesting because there's not all that much empirical work on this. Like, do people really have these expectations? Now, sorry for going on a bit, but I'll just go into this a little bit, right?
We invited you to do so.
Yeah, true. So tough. Now you're getting it, right?
Yeah.
So the whole central banking edifice is based upon the following notion. In the 70s, wages and prices got out of whack. So we need to have people like Paul Volcker, who are unafraid and unelected, to come along and raise interest rates and cause a huge recession. Now, we're sorry for the recession, sorry for the capital destruction, the unemployment, but it has to be done to reset people's expectations so that prices go down. That's what you have to do. And now we're going to build these big independent central banks all around the world. And anytime you guys try and get a wage increase, we're just going to raise interest rates to kill the effect. So don't even try. And you get a long period of price stability, but you also got a long period of wage stagnation, right, which is part of the problem. You then fill that in with credit. That goes wrong in 2008 to bring that story back in, right? But this is the idea, signaling credibility, sort of this sort of stuff. We'll raise rates, don't you try it, this sort of stuff. And we looked into this, and there was a brilliant paper by some economists at the Bank of Spain, and they scraped the web of New Zealand. I didn't know you could do such a thing. And they did this because New Zealand has had inflation targeting on their central bank longer than anyone else in the world. They've got 40 years of inflation targeting. Now, it may be the case that you and your grandmother and one of your listeners and, you know, my daughter who's 14 doesn't really pay attention to central bank forecasts. But you would think people in the financial sector would. So they basically looked at basic communications in the financial sector, but granular level, what people swapped, basically sort of the email level. I don't know how they got this stuff. But anyway, what they found out is you were hundreds of times more likely to pass around a cat video than an inflation forecast if you worked in the financial sector. So we just went, well, hang on a minute. So if this isn't what's going on, what's really going on? And that's what motivated the book. You had all these different stories, these very confident assertions about it's the 70s and we do this, but it's obviously not the 70s. So how should we think about inflation? Well, should we think about it as this kind of expectations process? Well, we started that way, and then we started to get into it. We started to get more and more suspicious of it, and that's where the rest of the book came from.
Another thing that happened in the pandemic and maybe sort of the later years of the pandemic, and I don't know if we have a clear line of when pandemic ends, but that is, there was this feeling that it was a workers' market, or that it was it was a good time for workers, that there was wages were going up, workers were able to leave to find other. It was a good moment for labor. And this sort of, you were talking about the 1970s, and again, this isn't the 1970s as you said, but that's something that sort of reminds me about the 1970s as well. Isn't 1973 kind of the high mark for where workers are the biggest part of GDP?
Correct. That's exactly right. So 65% of everything that's in the country goes to workers in the form of wages. Now, where are we now? Well, it's dropped by 10 or 11 percentage points over the past 40 years. But here's the really interesting statistic. Corporate profits are now 12.5% of GDP. They've never been higher. Now, let's go back to something you said that I want to get into a little bit. Because, you know, if it's really just the case that the Democrats offered all this stuff and people don't want it, that's an interesting one. And why do they keep voting for Trump, right? Well, if you're in the bottom two quintiles, the 20th percent to 40th percent of the income distribution, right? You're the poor working poor in America, right? Remember when Trump had that face-off with the Fed in 2017, where he said, don't you dare raise interest rates, you run the economy hot? Well, what actually happened was it wasn't just him bullying them. The Fed had all this stuff called Fed Listens, and they used to go out to Milwaukee and talk to people about monetary targeting. And everyone in Milwaukee's like, what are you talking about? Here's what we're concerned with. And they began to actually go, let's not be knee-jerk on this one. Let's allow the economy a bit more. Let's see if inflation shows up. Let's not assume that it's going to show up. And what happened was, for about 2.5 years, the real wages of people in the 20th and 40th percentile actually went up under Trump. And that hadn't happened since the 1980s. right? So there's a reason that these people remember this as being a time when they finally got a break. So there's a bit, and when you go back to the pandemic, I mean, the original version of what we were talking about was called Build Back Better. Build Back Better was going to be basically expansion of social care and all this sort of stuff. Well, there are limits on this one in the sense that what we've got now, in part because of the way that we funded what we did in the pandemic, was we went from a place where we had loads and loads of space in the economy, if you will, to issue debt to do things, the useful investments. And we spanked about 40% of GDP on the 2008 crisis. And then basically COVID caused about another 20% increase on top of that. So now that you've got Trump, for various reasons I'm happy to get into, trying to basically talk down the dollar and get less people to hold American assets, the bond market's getting nervous. Our ability to do the stuff that we could have done then seriously curtailed in the present moment, even if it was a different administration. So, it's a very different, volatile environment.
Do you see this bill that the Senate will now be taking up, this big, beautiful bill passed by the House of Representatives, extend tax cuts and institute significant cuts to Medicaid? Do you see this as part of that dynamic?
Yeah, absolutely. You want to have your tax cuts for your people at the top, then somebody's going to have to pay for it. You're not going to gut the military, so that's a huge item. You can't go after Social Security, at least not on round one. So, you're going to go after Medicaid. As Steve Bannon said the other week, a lot of MAGA's on Medicaid, right? And they're the people that are going to bear the brunt of the costs for this. So, again, it's a question of, you vote for certain things, and then when it comes true, this is the way that it forms out, unfortunately. Whether that bill gets through in its current form is, open to question. There's been a bit of a bond market reaction. It's been a little bit overplayed how serious it is. But ultimately, you have told people that the United States Treasury bill actually now responds to news. So let me go into this for a little minute. There's a reason everybody else in the world uses dollars for all of their borrowing, all their spending, all of their trading with each other internationally, because everybody else accepts it. Why does everybody else accept it? Because it doesn't matter what the news flow is, its value is the same. You lend the United States government $100 for 10 years, you get $100 back and you get the interest payment at the same time over the 10-year period. Nobody questions it. So you can sell it instantly. It's like cash, but it gives you a payment. So this is the best thing ever, right? Now, there's lots of side effects to this, which is part of like what the Trump people are trying to counteract, right? But ultimately, when you do that and everybody banks in it, it has to be invariant to the news flow. Once you start screwing around with that directly, as Trump did with his tariffs and got the reaction on April 2nd through April 9th, then the Treasury market starts to look like, as a financial market called it, a risk asset. There's risk built into this. Do I really want to hold this thing? Will it be there in 10 years' time? Am I going to have to pay a tax on it? Once you do that, that changes your debt dynamics, a whole bunch of stuff. So the ultimate constraint on this bill and what the United States wants to do in the long run is, are people willing to keep buying dollars? Well, in a sense, there's no other alternative out there because everybody already uses it. As imagine like everybody uses Microsoft Word, and then the next day Microsoft Word is banned from all computers. Like, what would you do? Where would you go? What platform would you use, right? But if you give people enough time, they'll figure out alternatives. And that's actually part of the Trump strategy. They kind of want that to happen. That's part of the reshoring, manufacturing, not just basically importing everything, because we can do it without limit because everybody else wants these dollars. So there's a whole dynamic built into this as well.
There is a logic to Trump's tariffs and threats of tariffs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Biden took all of Trump's tariffs and built them into the IRA and extended them. Right? They didn't go down at all. They didn't disappear. In fact, they were actually targeted more on the tech sector, but they were general tariffs. Trump's, shock and awe liberation day is a classic move of ask for the moon and the stars and then settle for planet Earth, right? But the logic is still the same. You basically want to make it very expensive for people who are currently importing in the United States to do so. And the way that they get access to the big, beautiful American market is by making it here. Lots of problems in that one, right? Usually if you're doing this, it's called developmentalism. You then have a state that allocates sectors and gives financial credits and channels investment. We've just kneecapped ours with Doge. We have it with the IRA. It would be smart to repurpose that for the purposes that they want to do, which is double down on the carbon economy, but they don't seem to have any interest in that. So if you kneecap your state and at the same time then you go after all your universities, which screws up your skill formation, Tariffs alone, not sure if it's going to get you there, but there's a logic there, and it was one that was actually kind of shared by Biden. This consensus has been there for 10 years. It's just that nobody's really called it out.
And it's to reindustrialize the United States, to be able to make things
Yeah,
here.
this is what the other thing the pandemic showed us was that we don't make anything, right? I mean, even simple things like, plastic for nurses, masks. What was the one there was a great example in the pandemic. I can't remember exactly what it was. It was one kind of critical healthcare component. And even 12 months later, 90% of the supply still came from China. Now, regardless of geopolitics and what one thinks of China and so on and so forth, it's just a bit mad to have that type of dependence on another country because things like pandemics happen. And what it did was it kind of raised the lid on, there's a lot of stuff we don't do. Have you a really good book on this? It's Peter Goodman, who's a New York Times bureau reporter. And he did a book it's called something like When the World Ran Out of Everything. And through the thread of the story is a story about a guy down in the south, I think it's in Georgia, who invented a kid's toy that's really good for autistic kids. It calms them down. And first of all, he tried to make it in America pre-pandemic, and the costs were just through the roof because nobody does this type of work anymore. We just buy it from China. And eventually he tried to buy it from China. He did, and he got a great product that was so cheap. And he's like, I'm going to bring it in. Then the pandemic hit and he couldn't get it in. And then after the pandemic, he tried to get it done in America. And he just couldn't. Right. And what happens is when you don't do stuff for 20 years, you lose all the skills. So this is one thing that the Biden ran into with the IRA. You can get Hyundai to open up a $100 million battery factory in Kansas, but they'll stop working on it when they realize they don't have any workers within 100 miles who know how to work in a factory because it just hasn't been done for a generation. So
something that can't be done very complex. Something that can't be done overnight. I mean, you have to have
not overnight, over like a decade to rebuild this stuff. I mean, had the Democrats won, the idea was IRA 1 was essentially get the investments in, expansion into green sectors, cutting edge technologies. IRA 2 would have been skills. It would have been basically skills and mobility, expanding and redeveloping the technical college sector, trying to get people through these things, HVAC, electricians, all the stuff that you need. I mean, the notion that sort of, America doesn't have factories anymore, it's not true. We still have a big manufacturing sector. There's just lots of things we don't do. But if you talk to manufacturers, they'll tell you, I don't know where you're going to get your labor from because they're already offering $35 to $40 an hour for people who work in factories. And they'll rather work for 20 in an office because it's hard. It's difficult work. So, this notion that we're just going to raise tariffs and everything's magically going to happen, I think they're going to be slightly disappointed with the results.
So trying to re-industrialize the country, I mean, doesn't on the face of it sound like a bad idea? You mentioned, like, look what happened during the pandemic. We realized we didn't make anything. It was hard to get things from other places because of the pandemic. In the future, you could be at war in which you need to have an industrial base. I mean, there's reasons why you would want to have an industrial base here. Is it? But is it a quixotic idea to go back to an or to re-industrialize after you've already de-industrialized?
Well, nobody's ever done it before, and at a planetary level, we're actually deindustrializing. As societies get richer, it seems to be the case that they spend less money on things that they make and swap with each other, and more money on services and things that they do with each other. So as the planet gets richer, services tend to overtake manufacturers. If you're trying to if you're concentrating on strategic sectors, war fighting capability, critical electronics, etc., absolutely. But even if you do that, there's still such a thing as costs. So, let's say take Steve Jobs, who's under a lot of pressure from the Trump administration, because you'll get out of China by going to India, and they're like, no, it's not going to work. You have to bring it here. Well, apart from the sheer complexity of their supply chain, where like the iPhone components are made in 8 different countries and assembled in 12 different places and all this sort of nonsense, if you actually were to bring all that home, you wouldn't have the workers to do it. If you magically found the workers to do it, they live in America. It would just cost 3 times as much. So what are you going to do? You need to have like a 300% tariff on every imported phone, and we would be able to then buy Apple, but it would now cost like $2,000 for an iPhone. Nobody's going to buy it, right? So cost no matter. How do you get the cost down if that's your only card? You're going to automate. It's going to be where AI comes in. It's going to be robotics. It's going to be advanced manufacturers. You're going to have factories that are going to look nothing like the imaginary of the 1950s. So, one of the ways that I think about the current administration is the imaginary is we want the economy of the 1950s for men. We want the social policies and social world of the 1940s for women. And we want the foreign policy of the 19th century, which is essentially we're a hemispheric block and to hell with the rest of the world. The problem is you can't go back in time.
Is there a limit to the world, the global economy, to becoming more and more deindustrialized? I mean, at some point we need a global industrial base, right?
Oh yeah, there is. It's just that what happens is its footprint shrinks. I mean, basically, if you can think, for example, of like China, and over 5 years ago, nobody was driving electric vehicles out of China, at least, right? Now they dominate the entire planet's supply chain. Why? Because they can manufacture at scale. They've got absolutely millions of workers. They've also got millions of robots. You go near a BYD car plant, I mean, this thing's just like robots on speed, just knocking these cars together and throwing them out because they're pretty easy to make. If you make them from base, you don't try and retrofit a petrol car, which is what the Western companies have been trying to do. So yeah, you'll have a smaller footprint. You'll have as much, if not more, output. But kind of as a chunk of your economy, it's actually less, right? Deindustrialization in other places is interesting. Like Latin America is losing industry. Well, why is that? Because China's so damn competitive, right? Why would you make it in Brazil if you can make it in China? So, then the Brazilians say, well, hang on, all that's happening here is we're just getting imports dumped on us and we're losing our ability to make things. So this isn't just something that's happened to the United States. You can see this working out everywhere. The Europeans are very nervous about Chinese auto exports destroying what's left of their car industry. So, this is something that's not unique to Trump. His approach to it is unique, but the question and the issue is not unique.
Is in China, with the making of electric cars, are the workers able to buy electric cars too? Sort of like the early years of Ford in our motor industry?
Their cheapest one's $6,500. And they'll give you the financing. So yeah, absolutely. They've got a huge home market, but they make so much of this stuff, the costs fall so quickly that what you end up with is we need to sell this somewhere else because we can never absorb this ourselves, which is why China is still one of the world's largest exporters. Like China's share of exports as a proportion of the economy peaked in 2006 at 40%, and it's now down to about 20%. So it's halved. But the economy is now 2.5 times the size. So there's actually even more stuff coming out. And, part of the problem is we've been running a world where countries, I should say, like China and also the EU, particularly since the financial crisis, have been running a surplus against the rest of the world. What it means is they double down on exports. They make more stuff than they can ever eat themselves. And so it has to find a home somewhere else. And the other countries, basically the Anglo countries and the oil exporters, are like, sure, we'll take it. And then we just give them financial claims, like bonds, right? Now, this has been great, but the cost of that is like, we don't make any of that stuff anymore. They do all the making, right? And then they basically have all these IOUs from us that at some point we're going to have to redeem for them. So, and there's a general feeling of which, the Trump move is one of them, that these imbalances need to be addressed.
Has China learned from the United States deindustrialization process and trying to not go down that same route?
Oh, very much so. Here's a fun story. I think his name's I'm going to get it wrong. Yan Weining, right? So he was a political scientist who was given an award by the American Political Science Association to come from China, and I think it was 1994. And do a Tocqueville. So just like Alexis de Tocqueville, author of Democracy in America, came from France, ran around America and said, oh, look, they're weird over here. And look at the South. That's a bit mental. And so on and so forth. So he came over and basically set himself up at some university, I think it may be Michigan or someplace like this, and started touring the United States. And it's just when we went from basically the deindustrialization Rust Belt shock of the 80s into the full-blown outsourcing of the 90s. And he just wandered around these places like Gary, Indiana and stuff and just went, who does this to themselves? This is bonkers. So he went back to China and he wrote a book basically saying, this is not the country you think it is. This is craziness. And it actually got a lot of attention from the party, and he became a close advisor of Xi. So, yes, they absolutely learned from this, and they learned that, there's no way in hell we're going down that road. The second thing, what they also learned was don't be a part supplier for the US. Start doing stuff yourself, because that's ultimately what makes you rich and powerful. And that's what they've been doing for the past 10 years with their Made in China 2025 project.
Is Trump studying China?
Who knows if Trump's studying anything? I mean, the people around him are various degrees of China skeptics. I mean, the way I think about the administration is if you take China as one of the issues, right? So you got Navarro. Navarro would literally wipe them off the map if he was given half a chance. This is like a feral hatred of China, right? So he sort of takes the imbalances argument and just runs it to the extreme that China needs to be punished, etc. Then you've got your kind of what used to be the never Trumpers, who I now call the whatever Trumpers. In other words, they've kissed the ring. So that's Rubio and people like this. And their traditional thing to look tough in the world is always like the Chinese Communist Party is a terrible threat. We have to be terrible to China, blah, blah, blah. And then you've got the national conservatives around Bannon and people like this, the MAGA crowd, and they're like, we don't really give a shit about China. This is not our thing. Like, we're concerned with China to the extent that they've taken our industrial base and would like it back, please. But other than that, they don't really care. Then what you've got is the tech lords, and the tech lords absolutely do not want you to piss off China because their supply chains are all tied up there, right? And also American corporates in general. So you have this entire constellation that basically vary from China's the worst thing in the world to like, let's dial it back on China. And I think you see that all the time in the way the administration is like day by day, which one of these voices is getting near Trump. And there's that much volatility around it.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with Mark Blyth. Mark Blyth is a political economist and professor at Brown University and co-author, along with Nicolò Fraccaroli, of the book Inflation, a Guide for Users and Losers. What do you think about this saying that China is ripping the United States off?
Oh, this is the dumbest thing ever. Look, these are voluntary contracts, right? Think of the guy who's making the toys for autistic kids, right? So he tries to make it in America, but it's going to mean the toy costs $60. He goes reluctantly to China. He can make it for 20, import it, take his costs off that, sell it for 35, make 20% margin. What are you going to do? Nobody's ripping anybody off, right? You just can't make it here or it's too bloody expensive. So let's go to another one, Europe. In 2008, Europe and the United States were the same size economically. They both had economies of about $17 trillion. That was the size of the economy. Since then, the Europeans got serious with austerity, cutting down their budget in the middle of a recession and holding everyone to crazy fiscal rules. And what they did was do serious damage to that economy. They didn't grow for a decade. And what that's meant is the United States is now a third bigger than Europe. So if Europe's, literally to quote Trump, right, the EU was designed to screw us, right? It's the weirdest version of screwing us ever because they're now a third smaller. So no, they have not been screwing. What they've been done is exporting stuff to us that's cheaper than it should be. We've been paying with IOUs called treasuries. They've been taking that money and investing it abroad in stuff that's really crap. They would have been better investing it in their own economy. But they don't want to invest in their own economy because if they did, wages would go up, prices would go up, people would have a good time. But then your BMW would be more expensive and you can't sell it to the US. So they're caught in a crappy trap of basically squeezing their own workers so they can remain competitive. China's the same way, while exporting to us. And we're on the other side of this, getting cars, TVs, pharma, and everything we want for an IOU. But the cost is we don't do any of that stuff ourselves.
I mean, the ones who are really ripping everyone off are the American corporations.
Absolutely. 40% of China's output is still multinational corporations, the majority of which are American.
So we're talking about American companies that are doing this, not China.
That's who started it. I mean, the entire thing was the Chinese basically said, all right, look, we're in abject poverty. Mao was a nutter. How do we feed the people? And they had this idea of like a special economic zone where we'll try capitalism, but we'll keep it at arm's length. Now, what's our comparative advantage? We've got tons of cheap labor. Some of it's price skilled. If we build some really good infrastructure, we're going to get lucky. Why are we going to get lucky? Because they've just invented this thing called information technology, and that allows real-time tracking of things that you can put in this new technology called shipping containers, right? So you just add all that together and say to American corporates, come on over here, don't pay any taxes, and we'll take your wage bill down by 2/3. And they're like, okay. They move their entire supply chain and production chain there to Shenzhen and these places, and then they start selling it back to us. So, you know, the notion, like, here's one for your listeners, right? Name a Chinese company. Well, you might come up with Huawei, the tech company, right? Okay, give me another one. Lenovo, the guys that make the old IBM computers. Got another? Well, yeah, BYD, because you've heard about it, but you've never seen one on American roads, right? Okay, who's importing all that stuff in the United States? It's American and other multinational corporations. It's not the Chinese. It just happens to be made in China.
we exchanged making things for cheaper prices.
That was the deal. Basically, the social contract rewrite under Bill Clinton was as follows. We're not going to do this anymore, lads, but don't worry, Walmart's going to be cheap as chips.
And it was.
And it was. Remember all the way through the 90s and 2000s, Walmart's TV advert was the prices keep falling, and it was the Walmart price things falling all the time. That was the deflationary effect of 500 million Chinese joining the global workforce and making stuff really, really cheap at scale. Now, their wages eventually rise. Their own domestic economy is getting bigger. Yes, they're still a huge exporter, but we're more bothered than they're worth. I mean, they've been diversifying away from us as much as they can over the past 5 years because they know that we're just a pain in the ass who hates them. So they are now moving their investments into Indonesia, Vietnam, all the rest of it. All the growth in the world isn't in the old people's countries of Western Europe or the United States. It's all in Asia, where they're growing at 4, 5, 6, 7% a year.
So looking at you mentioned Bill Clinton, the 1990s, we get NAFTA, sort of, all these things. Mm-hmm. Is this a short-term boon that we got ourselves into that would last for, the next 20 years or so, which would obviously last through many people's political careers during
and some people's lifetimes, absolutely.
For long-term consequences?
I think so, because let's imagine it all goes really well. What's the business model here? It's a complete destruction of green investments. Now, what's the weird thing about the global populace, right? They all hate windmills. It's a weird thing, right? But they all really hate windmills. They also they care about bird migration. It's like, you don't care about bird migration, but whatever, right? Now, why do they hate windmills? Because if you think about the notion of a green transition, here's what it means if you're in a Republican state. So let's go through the core of the Republican states, right? Alaska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas. Go through Texas, go to the Panhandle, Alabama, Mississippi, etc., come up to West Virginia. It's the absolute core. Now, these are all functional state economies. We can talk about the levels of education, poverty in the Panhandle, disease, etc., but they work, the places that work, right? They're not on Medicaid to the extent that, for example, the Southeast and, for example, the hollowed out Northeast is. Now, if you're in one of these states, the last thing you want to do is become the next Midwest. And you've got a perfectly functional business model. It's based on carbon, fuel, fracking, farms, fertilizer, all of the carbon products that you get from plastics, petrochemicals, feedstock, right? That's what they do. And we can't live without it. We can't go anywhere. We can't heat our homes. This is what they do. And then they look at the IRA and go, so let me get this straight. You're going to want to build all these windmills and you're just going to shut me down? The value of my assets go to zero, while once again, you guys who are invested in all the green stuff, you make the profits. So the coast make out and the heartland gets destroyed again? Nah, over my dead body. So basically, the way that they look at this is an existential thing about their business model versus the green business model. So if you go to Texas, for example, people are like, yes, but Texas is 40% of all renewables. Yeah, but you know what? They'll always be on tap. They'll never be on top. Right? There's not a transition. It's adding more to keep the air conditioning going. There's no fundamental change in the business model. There's no phase out of any of this stuff going on. And that's basically what they want to do. Now, if you think about it over a 10-year period, imagine that you can get the rest of the world to pump more oil. You push out your own marginal producers in fracking. They're useful, but you don't really care about them. And you've got the lowest levelized energy costs in the world for electricity by doing this. On a short-term basis, you then put up tariffs. You then invite companies to come and make in a very, very big market. You can imagine a world where, at least in principle, this works. You run down your external balances with your treasuries. You start this little poison pill thing in the big, beautiful bill about putting a tax on treasuries that the markets are nervous about. Yeah, we don't want you to take IOUs anymore. We want you to take the new manufacturers that we're going to be making. Now, this all sounds good, but the thing is, what type of manufacturers are you going to do? You're not going to do anything green. Now, what's the rest of the world doing? They're all moving into that space. So what we're going to end up with, and my sort of like nightmare version of this is, we're going to reshore all this production. And 10 years from now, we're going to be making the world's most expensive F-150 trucks. They're going to have a 6.5 litre Hemi engine and get about 6 miles a gallon, but it won't matter because we still got cheap gas. Meanwhile, everybody else in the world is running a BYD that's got a 1,000-mile range on a mixed sodium battery. At that point, who's going to want your exports, even if you brought them back? That's the long-term cost.
And hard to get out of that.
Yeah. There's no sort of like, you can play carbon. I call this, I'm writing a book about this just now. I call this a strategy of carbon dominance. And you can do carbon dominance in any one country, but you can't enforce it globally. Simply because, A, the renewables are much cheaper. And also because for many countries around the world that find oil to be a really difficult thing for them to handle, China, India, etc., it's always been their stress point on their balance of payments. If you can basically get rid of a lot of your electricity costs by moving off of oil and coal and into renewables, then their costs start to go down and suddenly they have a bit more room. So you can see why it's very hard to sort of, you can send your energy guy running around the world saying that net zero is weird and it's a leftist plot, but to the extent that anyone's actually going to listen to it when they look at the hard numbers, that's a very different story.
So it's not just about trying to reduce greenhouse gases to slow global warming. It sounds like there's actually a market reason.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, people are we live in a capitalist world. Capitalists are concerned with one thing, profits. Capitalists are rewarded for one thing, profits. You keep your job in the C-suite with a nice big salary, so long as you're maximizing shareholder value, you got profits. Until you change that system, the only way you get investment in any sector and transformative levels of investment is if you basically can make profits out of it. Now, 2/3 of the stuff that you need to do for climate change, unfortunately, has no profit case, so that's a bit of a problem. But for the 1/3 to do with things like energy production, you can absolutely do it. But then you've got to think about the people who are on the other side of this trade, whose assets are going to lose value. That's your Republican states in the current moment, and that's why they hate windmills.
And right now we're in a drill, baby, drill.
Exactly, because drill, baby, drill is going to give you the lower energy costs, which are going to go along with the tariffs to bring back the companies. That's the idea.
Is that another short term?
Define the short term for me.
The rest of this presidency? I guess the next 3
probably
years.
Probably two presidencies. You probably get two presidencies out of this before the costs of it become apparent as the rest of the world moves in another direction.
Yeah. In Inflation, your latest book, you talked about the 1990s. Well, let me add one more thing in. As we talk about the 1990s, I was a young man then, but I do remember the 1999 Battle of Seattle on the left, the protest against the WTO meeting. I remember the presidential run of Ross Perot.
The absolute really giant sucking sound as all those jobs go to Mexico.
Yeah, on the other side of the political
wrong.
Spectrum. It sounds like neither of them were wrong.
Well, yeah, but this is the thing. We go through these big cycles in history whereby capital markets become open and capital flows to the place where it's the most profit, and that leads to development in one place and then hollowing out in another place. And then eventually, if you get enough hollowing out, people turn towards the state for protection. I mean, we think about tariffs as these economic instruments, but, they're a form of protectionism. The clue is in the word. You're actually protecting your public. If you listen to the language of Bannon and people like this in the National Conservative Movement, it's very much a kind of Herrenvolk welfare for the natives and protection from markets, higher taxes. These guys, Bannon said that he'd like to have 40% tax on everybody who earns more than $1 million. And I think he's quite serious about that. I couldn't imagine a mainstream Democrat actually proposing that, because they're the people in the top 20% who are going to be taxed. That's how far we've come.
Is that National Socialism?
Well, I don't want to make a direct historical parallel with it, but if you want to make that connection in your head, let's just say that nationalists and socialists don't have to come in the brown shirt version. There are many different forms of it. And it's another form whereby people go to the state to get protection from what markets are doing to them. And that can take various forms. One's a New Deal type form, one's a very red communist form, and one's a sort of brown fascist form. I hate using the word fascist. I think it's grotesquely overdone. Is this an authoritarian reactionary force? Absolutely. And it's a particular version, as I said, of imagining we can have the male economy of the 50s, the woman society and mores of the 1940s, and then the foreign policy of the 19th century. And again, I just don't think you can pull all that together in one trick.
But fascism, you don't see in the United States.
Look, if you mean by that a genocidal party that has got a social movement behind it that wants to start a world war, no, we don't have that. We really don't have that. If you mean people who have an authoritarian tendency, who are quite happy to shut down aspects of democratic debate and deliberation and sideline legislators to get things done because they see an emergency, then yes, but that then makes it into a very broad palette.
coming back to the 1970s again, what's important to know about what was known as the Volcker shock?
So the Volcker shock, to me, and a very respected economist and central banker called Alan Blinder, was something that was like bolting the barn door after the horse is bolted. If you think that the way you control inflation is by killing everyone's price expectations by causing a recession, then Volcker did what was necessary. However, Alan and others have put forward this other hypothesis that what we saw in the 1960s was just a bunch of supply shocks that happened to all arrive at the one time. Everything from the cost of the Vietnam War, integrating women and minorities into the economy at scale as consumers, failed harvests in Russia and Canada, the oil crisis in 74. And that basically was a bunch of supply shocks that basically had an inflationary impact, and then it died out. But then the next one came along. So it looked like it was all one series of things, in which case it was already on the way out and already dying, and Volcker didn't need to do it. But the lesson we took is this is why we always go to interest rates and raising interest rates. Interestingly, this time around, when banks raised interest rates, they raised them from 0 to around 5 to 6%. It was hardly the Volcker shock. They were very careful about what they were doing. They did not want to start a giant recession right after COVID, because that would be the end of their jobs, and they knew it.
Mark Blyth, again, is a political economist and professor at Brown University and author of the book Inflation, A Guide for Users and Losers. Mark Blyth, that was very informative, and I thank you very much for taking this time.
Great conversation. I loved it. Let's do it soon.